We're recording the session. That means that there will be a transcript, the chat, and so on will be recorded, and those will convert into the kind of minutes of the meeting, which is just easier for me to do it that way. Joe, if you're able, if people are coming in and we need to admit them, could you kind of check that and admit them in? Thank you. What we've got today, first of all, I think, unless I see her name appear, is an apology from Alina. So she has got a migraine. So unfortunately, she's not here, and hopefully she'll get over that as soon as she can. So I'm going to be kind of doing more of the talking than I was expecting, because a lot of the work I want to show you today is Alina's work on the legal side of the DIA. So first things first, there's a project code and intellectual property rights framework for all the work we do on CEFACT. A fairly simple sort of rules and regulations there. They're basically along the lines that everything we do is effectively an open source, royalty-free contribution that becomes part of the sort of recommendations made by CEFACT to member states of the United Nations. And the code of conduct are along the lines that if a head of delegation, that's a country representative for the United Nations, recommends an expert to participate, then we should welcome that expert in. We've got a fairly open school approach to this project anyway, so I'm welcoming anybody in that has contributions to make, bearing in mind this idea about intellectual property rights and so on. So very happy to offline talk about becoming a registered expert if that's still an issue for people. But our kind of working approach at the moment is, if you've applied and shown to Alina or I that you've applied, then we'll assume you accepted the terms and conditions. It's taking a bit of time for some requests to be processed. Somebody has some noise coming through. Seems to have stopped. So today, and probably tomorrow as well, we're going to do a few things that we're going to when we get to the actual agenda items, recap on last two weeks ago. We talked about GLIFE, the Global Legal Entity Identifier Framework, and also GS1 and other frameworks. We'll recap briefly on those discussions, and then we'll talk about the new stuff, which is about the digital identity anchor and some of the work that Alina's been doing and that Joe and I have reviewed, and that also Marcos has contributed to. I don't know if I can see Marcos. I can't see Marcos on the call at the moment. What I suggest is, if you're new to the show, please just put something in the chat to say hi. Unless I'm very happy if someone wants to say hello and introduce themselves, that will give me a break from talking. So if you want to put your hand up, very, very welcome to say hello if you've not been on the show before. I'll give it a second or two. Either everyone's too shy or we're all been here before. Cool. Okay. What we talked about 2 weeks ago were two things. One was what to do with the existing work, and that's actually going to show you a bit of that again this time. So there was prior work done by the United Nations Transparency Protocol, which is another CEFACT project, on this concept called the digital identity anchor. And there's some materials that were under what was originally a GitHub repository, is now moved to a GitLab repository, and it's got a bundle of things that I'll sort of talk to you about. And I'm trying to work out with Steve Capel, who is the lead of the UNTP project, kind of what to do with that content, if you like. The idea that Steve had when he created, he's a vice chair of the UNCFACT Bureau as well. The idea he had when he created the momentum for this project was that this project would further that work, would actually take on the digital identity anchor kind of concepts and develop them further, and then make something more of it, if you like, and kind of own the changes. That's still kind of the plan. We'd work on that content now. I'm beginning to feel that, having done so and having come up with some ideas about how we could make it better or improve it or complete it, it might also still be a good idea that it kind of goes back into the UNTP folder for curation, because if you look at the UNTP spec, it's a specification for a protocol. They've defined a number of credential types that support that protocol, and it would seem odd to have one of those credentials sort of out of that protocol spec inside another space being maintained separately. I kind of think that ultimately it might make sense for them to be back inside UNTP, but for a moment, it's like, imagine we've taken a fork from the spec of UNTP, we're developing the DIA, and we're going to put it back in. So that's still a bit of an ongoing discussion with myself and Steve as to how best to do it. We've got a space I'll show you later about in GitLab already prepared for us to sort of work on the DIA spec itself. The other thing that we spoke more about was how do we work with existing systems, and that was quite an interesting conversation. So a lot of you will be familiar with the work of the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, GLIFE, a not-for-profit foundation based in Switzerland, founded by the Financial Stability Board, part of the G20. And it's a well-established organization that was created partly out of the kind of results of the global financial crisis, where it was recognized that particularly for payment systems and bank settlements and stuff, they needed a trustworthy identifier that they could use for these systems. So GLIFE was created as one of those things. Now, the interesting conversation that we were going through in 2 weeks ago was, how does something like GLIFE, and there are other types of systems, GS1, the barcode kind of famous organization, maintains identifiers as well, both for locations and organizations, and identifiers for products and so on. So how do these existing frameworks how do we fit in? Where does this global trust registry fit in? So I've crudely summarized the conversations of 2 weeks ago into sort of 3 key points. And by all means, if anybody were on the calls 2 weeks ago, or if you've seen the recording or read the meeting minutes, correct me if you like on these 3 summaries. But one of the first things is to say we're doing something different here. So what GLIFE does, what GS1 does, what many other organizations do, I argue are sort of self-evidently important. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist as an organization, or they wouldn't exist for very long. What we want to do here, I argue, is different to what they're doing. So we're adding a different value proposition. They add value too. We're adding value in a different way. The focus that we have, in particular, this global trust registry focus, because we come out of the UN CEFACT body, part of the United Nations, is this idea of nation-state registers. So a nation-state being obviously a recognized member state of the United Nations, a country, and for most of us is the term we'd normally use, and a country may have states within it, which is why nation-state can confuse people. But the idea, so Australia has states, of course, inside its foundation. The idea is of an authoritative registrar, as far as we are concerned, is one that's based in the legal jurisdiction of a member state of the United Nations. And that's different, because GLIFE isn't a member state of the United Nations. It's not a country. It's an organization. So it's GS1 and so on. So what they do and what they can say is different. And in fact, what they typically do is necessarily to rely upon the authoritative registrars and what they've said and what they do. So they add value on top. They do some extra things. They do some other things that registrars don't do, but they rely upon the registrar. Now, what we want to do in our project is to, first and foremost, recognize the existence of these authoritative registrars. Where are they? Who are they? What do they register in these nation-state countries? And then sort of move out from there towards what kind of digital artifacts do they produce? Can we recommend things that they could produce that would support supply chain transparency? That's the sort of part 2. Part 3 of the conversation is, I personally believe, and I think those actually Joe's on the call. Joe and I spoke with some of the people from GLIFE later on after those meetings 2 weeks ago, that there is value, mutual value, if you like, in the 2 organizations. That one of the things that GLIFE produces is this list of registrars that they use. So when they register companies, they recognize which registrar was the originator, if you like, of the legal entity. And that list, if you like, it could be kind of washed against, compared with the list we produce. There's a way of kind of cross-checking each other's work, or doing quality control checks, or even they could rely upon the list if the list becomes robust enough. Rely upon the list from the UN CEFACT body. There's a bunch of ways in which they could either enhance the quality of their work or reduce the volume of their work or whatever. Similarly, we can use what they produce to help provide that. So I think it was constructive. We've got a sort of a way forward about how we coexist. I'm going to give my voice a break. Joe, is that a reasonable summary? Do you reckon? Are you able to say?
No, that's exactly right, John. I think the challenge is with GLIFE and GS1. They were created for their own purpose, and that is what their focus is, and their scope, and the boundary of their responsibility. As you say, they tend to be a secondary identifier associated with organizations, based on but having gone through that process, the process that GLIFE and GS1 actually put in place then makes the artifact, or the identifier, and the various different data attributes associated with it trustworthy within the use of that in the governed framework of what it is that they provide. Now, that might be for specific transaction types. For example, in Australia, you're expected to use an LEI for over-the-counter derivatives trading and transactions. That's a specific activity that everyone's expected to utilize. If payment systems start to use LEIs, then they start using them, and I know that those are starting to be utilized in places like India as well, which is quite interesting. So, but they're trustworthy for particular activities. I think that's not where GTR is trying to play. GTR is just trying to recognize, and you tell me, and everyone tell me if you think I'm wrong. GTR is just trying to recognize, identify and recognize, discover, identify and recognize, if you like, those registries that are utilized, are available, and then what they're used for and in what context is going to be defined by the specific transactional frameworks that are built to recognize them and use them as a useful repository. I think you're right, John. It's about how GTR tries to evolve that directory, if you like, of registrars and what it is that they're useful for. So I think that's a good summary.
Thanks, Joe. Anybody else on the call the last 2 weeks ago? Do you reckon that sort of resonate with you guys? I think I could pick on someone. Dimmer, I think you were in on the call 2 weeks ago, were you? Does that make sense to you as well? That's unfair to pick on someone, isn't it?
I need a bit more warning. I have to find my phone.
Sorry, mate. I didn't mean to make it awkward.
No, look, I agree that as much as I'd love to have the massive registry of registries that rules them all, a lot of them are built for a specific purpose and have value that needs to be connected. I think we probably need to be smart about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How to get there.
Yeah, I agree. It's like there's a sort of simplicity about the what's it called, the benign dictator or something, but there's actually some dangers in that too. So I think we need more. And thanks, Sankashan, for your comment on the text. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. Remember, what we will do with this project is write down effectively the recommendations will be written into documents, which you'll all get to see and see how we're phrasing how they coexist and stuff. So it's not like it's laid down in concrete, but this is sort of where we're landing at the moment. The real discussion for this week is this idea about this digital identity anchor, which is one of the sort of main parts of work that we were tasked with by Steve Capel and CEFACT. And over the last few weeks, Alina in particular has been doing some work on the legal interpretation and meaning of digital identity anchor. And Marcus has also been doing some work on the kind of current text. And I don't think Marcus is online, so we'll show you what he's been working on, but I can't ask him to sort of walk through it. That's, if you look at this sort of busy slide here, that's mostly to do with digital identity anchors, this thing here where participants in the supply chain declare themselves to be a particular identity, a particular business. And what they're doing is using an identity anchor to sort of prove this. And we have a way of thinking about that, which is that to get a digital identity anchor, they have to go through a process. It's quite similar to the Glyph, BLI, GS1, and so on. It would be surprising if it was very different. The idea is you register as normal as an organization. You have to meet whatever requirements the jurisdiction in which you wish to operate in provides you to meet. And that's the sort of steps 1 and 2 and 3. So you go through, you apply, you get checked, you get told you've registered, and here's your business identifier. At this point, the idea from UNTP kind of adds new value. And the idea from UNTP is now the organization will provide to the registrar some information that they wish the registrar to sort of recognize. So say, I'm going to be using in the technology terms that we use here, DIDs. I'm going to use decentralized identifiers to identify my interactions in supply chains, and these are the DIDs I wish to use. So the idea is now that in the sort of secure communication between the registrar and the applicant has now said, and please include in your digital identity anchor that you issue recognition of these things I've supplied you about my DIDs. Now, you'll see later there's some ideas and thinking we've progressed on what the registrar should do with this information, what checks it should perform on the information provided to it by the applicant, and sort of there's a sort of logic that we think is reasonably complete, because as a set theory, it's like there are things inside the set and things outside, and that's obviously everything, and it's kind of that kind of logic we're using. So it's sort of it's complete enough in the way it works. So we'll get to that in a second, but that's digital identity anchor. This is where the existing work is for the spec for UNTP. So if I click this, I think it will open. Yes, it will open inside this view. So this is the current web page presentation of the markdown document. This is for you to access. Everybody can read it. You can sort of see how they've expressed the idea of a digital identity anchor, and you'll see some of this materials in some of the slides we used a few weeks ago. And you'll see also there are a few requirements, 8 requirements so far, expressed some time ago now for digital identity anchors, logical model, and a bunch of other things. So that's kind of what we inherited. Those pages, the GitLab pages, are these pages. This is what it looks like on GitLab for the UNTP project. So I had to log in and out again, so I'm not logged in at the moment. But so you can see it without signing in. If you're a signed in person, you can do the issues and the kind of comments and fork and so on. And they also produced a way of looking at the vocabulary. So there's a vocabulary sort of page. So what's inside a digital identity anchor as a specification, where you can explore that through this sort of interface. And they've even got, which I think is a derived content. I'll actually explore this with Steve Capel, who'll be with me tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. They've got a kind of representation of that using a jargon sort of page, where you can kind of explore things and sort of try things and do stuff. But I reckon this is derived from the spec, which is in fact the GitLab pages, I think, are the kind of primary specification for the UNTP's model of digital identity anchor, and the other elements are sort of representations of that spec. But that's what I'm going to be confirming with Steve tomorrow. What that means is, we need to kind of respect that or move on from that and work on that. What is interesting, I think, from my point of view, is when Alina started working on this. So Alina, if you remember, is the other co-lead for this project. She's one of the registrars of registradores in Spain, and looks after land asset sort of registration, and is a lawyer by training. So she has a particular perspective that I don't have on things. So what she started with, if I scroll down, is what are the legal requirements for a digital identity anchor? So what does it mean legally if an authority, a registered authority, issues a DIA? What can both the receiver of this digital identity anchor make of it? What does it mean legally? And if they present it to somebody else, what does it mean to the somebody else, the other party? What kind of claims can be made? What roles, responsibilities, whatever could be said? So that's what she started to lay out in this document. And that's, if you remember when I briefly showed you the spec, let's go back to that maybe here. Maybe I'll go this one. Is not something that is inside these requirements. Okay, so these requirements haven't thought about the legal meaning of the digital identity anchor in the trade process. So what Alina's done in this document is to think from a sort of fundamental first principles point of view about the legal meaning of a digital identity anchor. And she's also trying to blend it into the UN CITRAL body of work, which is this United Nations common law on trade and so on. So there's a lot of interesting thinking, and you'll see in these comments that Joe and I were pondering, trying to work out as technologists, what does this all mean? And Alina was trying to help us understand about kind of what it does mean. So one of the first things we were exploring is this statement says the digital identity anchor, maybe I should zoom a bit wider so you can maybe see that. There you go. The DI anchor shall be derived exclusively from authoritative identity data. Now, if you remember, I suggested that in the interaction pattern, the applicant to be a registered entity will have to go through the normal process of providing information to the registrar, and then they get a business identifier or an organization identifier, and then they will then there'll be a number of sort of other parts and pieces of this puzzle that are shared. So it's not just authoritative identity data. There's other things inside this DIA. So Joe and I were exploring these other things in the DIA, but we've got other types of information, which is where we landed on this idea here, which I think is still hopefully legible for you. I'll highlight it, which is the idea that there are things that the authoritative registrar asserts that are its responsibility, its legal right to say, you have this organization has this identifier. That's its sort of legal basis. If that organization has given it other information that it wishes to sort of provide as part of additional data, then the registrar might check that data. It might check to see that it's valid, that you are in fact at that address makes sense, that it's a reasonable address, or that that digital identifier does resolve to the place you says it resolves to, and it does seem to be yours. So there are various checks. So they could have a type of data that is theirs, a type of data that they've checked, and the third type of data logically would be, well, you told us that, but we're not making any other claims about it. So if I were to take a simplistic argument, it'd be like somebody saying my nickname is Fred, and you don't really care if the nickname's Fred or not. It's up to them to decide what their nickname is, if they are allowed to choose their nickname, and that's just it. There's no point in verifying it. So we can imagine there's these three tiers of information in the digital identity anchor: the ones that the authority legally declares to be what it knows and asserts and is in control of, the things that the registrar has checked and found to be true at the time of checking, but it may not actually be within its legal domain. It may be something else that was asserted by the applicant. And the third thing being stuff I was given that has no legal sort of meaning in the context of the DIA, but it might have meaning in the context of the subject's use of information. So not sort of validated by us. So that was what this conversation led to about legal nature and scope, which we're sort of progressing here. We then got on to this idea about the DIA, Digital Identity Anchor, serves solely as a verifiable digital reference to a registered entity. Now, and Joe quite reasonably took this to be, well, does that mean it's taken precedence, or it's not the precedent thing? What does that mean in terms of how the physical artifact that normally you get given as a company and the digital artifact work? And what Lena was going to and explains in the comments that she's provided is this UN CITRAL and MLETR model of thinking, which says that a digital record of the physical thing is as valid, if you like, in commerce as the physical thing. It's basically a set of laws, sort of as we have in other parts of laws, I'm sure you're probably familiar with, where things like digital identity have to be recognized in law as being equally valid to other forms of identity that you might present. So that was where she was going to with this. And it might be that our comments lead to subtly different wording that's used, but that's the sort of discussion that we had. Where she goes to here is this idea that a digital identity anchor in our context, in the context of the Global Trust Registry project and UNTP, should only be issued by an authority that is legally authorized to register certified tested identifier subject under applicable law. This is like a kind of recursive, reflective sort of part of the thinking, because if we say we only recognize, because it's the limit of our scope, authorities that are nation state registrars, then in a sense, by definition, the things that they issue are digital identity anchors of this type, and they're not of another type. So GLIFE issues verifiable legal entity identifiers. We're not saying they're not legal or identifiers, whatever. We're just saying they're not the thing we're doing. And that might mean we end up with a prefix, a UN CEFACT DIA or something, to say what we mean about the digital identity anchor. So that's where she's going to on here. Talks about life cycle. We start getting into what the components of digital identity anchor might be. And those are a sort of initial list. That's likely to probably progress into the data specifications side. So remember, this is work that Lena was doing purely from a legal perspective to start with. I think there's a need for us to sort of marry the data thinking, data specification thinking into the legal text as well, into the requirement text. Sort of, I'd like to write once and use many is the kind of approach, because I'm lazy. I don't want to write things 3 times because I'll get them out of sync. So I kind of think this list here is likely to be replaced temporarily, at least, by the data thinking kind of construction that we then pull this back into this particular requirement. And well, what else is there? So this is where we start recognizing the existence of other things. So what Alina's now saying is that whilst we assert that a digital identity anchor is kind of issued by the registering authority, and it's sort of their responsibility to do so, and whatever they declare to be true under their law is what they declare to be true under their law. They might choose, because the applicant has given them, to include other identifiers the applicant claims and can prove that they own or have been granted. So an EU ID, LEI, VLI, other types of things might be part of that. And that's where, if you remember, that 3-tier of data idea would go to, that whilst that's not the original data of the registrar, it's actually provided by the applicant and to some extent has been verified to be true by the registrar. These requirements here is where we're getting, I think we're pulling probably out of some of the existing text around the semantic mapping and interoperability mechanisms, the DIAs. And this is where, for me, the real work is. There's enough heft in the work that Alina's done so far, but where we start thinking about how to make this DIA a sort of interoperable construct that many others can use across many different types of domain, that's where it gets really kind of challenging, and many people in this call know that from personal experience. This is also equally interesting from a legal point of view. You say what it is and also what it isn't. And so this is sort of protective, I suppose, for those that do issue at some form of digital identity anchor, that the registrar can't be held to be responsible for a thing that they didn't declare to be true. It's anchoring it back in the applicable law would be the applicable law of the jurisdiction of the registrar that issues this document. That it won't be that there's one universal law. We will have many laws across many jurisdictions still. This project won't sort that out. And that you shouldn't infer anything else other than what the registrar has said is inferable. This is one area where I think we've probably overstepped the mark slightly. I wouldn't say that if Alina was on the call, but we've already, if you remember, there were 8 requirements in the UNTP spec for digital identity anchor. I'm looking at numbers 25, 26, 27, 28, 29 already. And I'm kind of worried about over detailing, if you like, to begin with. I think we can possibly go to a higher order level of thinking for some of these things, recognizing that the detail should come at some point or later, or would need to be specified by the registrar, but perhaps taking a different level of approach. I'm going to pause for a bit to see if there's any sort of questions that are coming out of this walkthrough, also to give my voice a little break. Okay, Joe, you got first.
Oh, did I just before Alex? Oh, great. No, just very quick one. In essence, do you think? I mean, okay, data protection and privacy. Yes, it's obviously a thorny topic. Do you think that the GTR is actually going to own any PII, or in that sort of thing that we should try and avoid doing that sort of thing? So if we can, let's not go there.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely agree, Joe. And for me, yes, I agree with that too. The directory of registrars is unlikely to hold any personal data, as far as I can see. It would be odd for it to do so. What we're saying is, does the digital identity anchor include it? And for me, that's sort of up to the registrars as to what they put in this. We would recommend not, but there I think we get into. I know that Anthony, for example, is on the line from Australia, and others in the past from in Australia, ASIC, the business registrar for Australia, are looking at sort of company director and that sort of personal relationship between people and companies. At some point that we might need to get there, but at the moment we're not worrying about that yet in sort of standard trade exchange documents. But yes, let's not do PII if we can avoid it. I think it's probably the best approach.
Is that a principle we need to?
I think you could write it as that. You could write,
Right.
you should, data minimization principle, right? You should record only what is necessary and nothing more than that. Particularly about people. Alex.
Yeah, I think you also need to be cognizant of different member state laws in this. I recently found out that in South Africa, legal entity data such as company name, like literal legal entity data, falls under PII in South African like GDPR equivalent. So, that for me was like, okay, we actually need to be very mindful that it's not just GDPR worldwide. There is like nuance in how data protection is applied. So I would be wary of using like shall language here, but would be more comfortable with having shoulds and then deferring to member state national law where applicable. So, best practices are things like data minimization, of course, but it needs to be in the context of the specificity of the national law.
Yep, that makes every sense, Alex. And it goes to one of the sort of principles that we cannot dictate the laws of, thankfully, cannot dictate the laws of nation states, and it's up to them to decide kind of what to do. So all the CEFACT will do is make recommendations. And so, yeah, it's worth reminding ourselves that too many shalls is too many shalls. It won't kind of work that way. The governance and supervision. This is interesting for me here. I think there's a again the same.
Sorry, John. I just thought it would be useful. Manuel made a really useful comment on the chat.
Oh yeah. Cool.
And I just wonder whether, Manuel, you wanted to sort of, have the opportunity to sort of just talk us through that, because I think we're talking about registrars actually, or registries actually reflecting other recorded information, but not having the liability and ownership of that information. Is that something you want to just articulate, because it's a really, really important point, I would have thought.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Well, it was regarding the previous point that John made about the several tiers of information that the registrar will have to attest to. First, those details which are actually recorded at the business register, which of course they can attest to and they can validate that information. But for those claims made by the legal entity, which you mentioned that they could check whether those are actually true or not, in many cases that wouldn't be an option. In the case of Spain, the registrars are statutorily even personally liable for any data they disclose as registrars. So they would not be willing, in my opinion, and also they wouldn't be capable from a legal standpoint to attest to those claims made by the legal entities. So, of course, this may be different in different jurisdictions, but I think we should restrict ourselves to those details which are actually recorded at the business register. And the claims made by the legal entities should stand on their own, not backed by the business register, which in many cases they cannot attest to those claims. Also, I would like to take the opportunity when it comes to referencing or including data from other digital identifiers, such as the LEI or the GS1 product identifiers. I think there's a lot of value in leveraging the work done by other organizations, and there's a lot of benefits to be reaped from rather than embedding information, maybe referencing or mapping to one another. Because in the case of the LEI, which we as the business registers in Spain, we are also part of the GLIFE, and we are local operating units issuing LEIs. You have the reference data linked to the LEI includes data elements such as the legal address and this be very, very useful also for identifying the premises of the company. And this is information which is actually trustworthy, because it has been checked and is also recorded at the business register. So whenever we have already trustworthy and validated information linked to other identifiers, we should definitely reference to those identifiers if available on a voluntary basis, of course. And because not every legal entity has the obligation to have an LEI, but in those cases where they have one, I think there's value in giving the legal entity the option to reference that identifier and have the means to look up that information in the authoritative source. In this case, it would be the GLAIF lookup system. So simply by including the 20-digit LEI, you can automate the lookup process to GLAIF's system, and you can see the information on when it was last validated, because there's at minimum an annual renewal, although that is changing. Now we are working on ongoing and permanent update of data. So simply by including the LEI when available and clicking or having the application check that LEI, you can have a very good assurance that for instance, the legal form of the entity is exactly what is reflected in the digital identity anchor, or that the address is actually that address which is already validated in the LEI. So I think that mapping various identifiers is very interesting and beneficial, and we should look into that. And also now you're entering the governance and supervision part of the document, and this is what, when I checked the documentation, that's what I found most complicated and trickiest, to be honest, because from my experience working for the last 10 years in the LEI system, I think that is where the crux of the matter lies, is governance. And there's keeping track of the legal status of the legal entities and handling concepts such as suspension and revocation is very, very tricky. It's very costly. And one thing that worries me is that since this is open source and voluntary, and there's, unless I'm mistaken, you can correct me, of course, there's not an intended fee to be placed for on users of these digital identity anchors. So how do we handle the governance and manage the processes such as challenging the data linked to a digital identity anchor? So that would be my main concern looking to the future, the governance part of the system, because in my experience is the most complicated part. So yes, thank you.
That was an excellent amount of contribution. Thank you. I'm going to kind of go back to this deck to sort of talk to a couple of the points you made. We'll use this diagram. It's not the one I normally choose to use, but it's easy to get to. So if you can see how my cursor's moving around, let me make this a bit better. I'll go like this. Okay. Right. So I think that works. You can see this little red thing I'm dotted moving around it. I'll make it even more like a pen. The thing that we're responsible for in this project is defining governance with respect to this bit. How might the directory of registrars work? What would the CEFACT kind of governance model be? Where we look at the governance of these registrars, we don't really have much to say about that. It's up to them. What we want them to do is to tell us how they govern themselves. So that in our directory, we recognize this registrar governs itself in the following way. It commits to the following update frequency of data. It does whatever it does, and that's up to it. So if they have a real-time, every minute check and they update the records, all fantastic. If they do it once a year, they do that. If they charge, to your point, if they charge for people to access the data, to check things, then we note that too. Okay, so we're not going to say in our central part here, thou shalt not charge for data access. That's not really our gift, right? We're not going to tread on the toes of existing registrars and what they do and how they operate. But we do need to tell people who want to find out, so the supply chain participants, if you do want to find out about a company in Spain and to see whether or not they've got the right kind of bona fides, then this is the path you follow. You go to this registrar, and there might be a fee associated with it, and that's okay. It's up to you if you want, if you want to follow this path, you follow this path, and that's where you go to, and that's what you would now need to do to execute the check. So it's more about whilst we'll give recommendations about things, the reality is, of course, is whatever the reality is right now, and that's what I'd actually like the project first and foremost to do, is to sort of recognize those things, that these things exist, these are how they do it, this is the, so you can be reassured, yes, it's the genuine registrar, that's what they normally ask for, and that's what you'd have to do if you wanted to check. The point you're making about the kind of concurrency and multiple identifiers, I think is really interesting and useful, and I agree. What I'm going to jump to now is a diagram we used 2 weeks ago, right? And in this diagram, this is how we were talking about the way Glyph works and how registration works in a normal registrar. So in this document, I've got I need to remove my pen marks. How do I do that? Clear all, excellent. So this area here is the existing registrar, a nation state, and the red area above on my screen is the Glyph kind of operation. Now, what's interesting about this is that the timeliness of updates of these two independent entities can be quite different, right? The local regulations and requirements for registration in a country might mean that the company is required by law to tell the registrar of any change to its circumstances within whatever period of time, minutes, days, hours, whatever it is. The LOU that has registered that company may have got an agreement with that company that you will tell us if your registration status changes, but there may be a contract between them about how quickly you need to tell the LOU, and then the LOU will tell Glyph, and then Glyph will make its update, which I think is 3 times a day at the moment, depending on what the LOUs are providing. But what we're saying here is that these things are loosely coupled, to use a phrase that Joe and I use, and they're kind of running independently of each other, potentially a different frequency of updates and so on. As I think Dima said earlier, that's kind of messy, but it's the reality. And all we can do is provide a kind of a map to that reality, saying this is the frequency with which updates are done. This is the frequency with these things. So when we've done our digital identity anchor, if it includes an LEI that was correct at the time of issuance as asserted by the subject, it's possible that the LEI inside the DIA is somehow out of sync with the digital identity anchor, the revocation issue. So my thinking at the moment is there are some very important considerations to capture in this directory of registrars, including frequency of update and revocation sort of process or approach, so that a relying party would know what to expect of that registrar if they see a party declaring that they've been registered by that registrar. They know how much reliance to place upon it in terms of how frequently it's updated, what the revocation process is, and how they can do some checks. So it's sort of, I agree, very useful to include this bundle of information like LEIs and GS1Ns and other things inside your DIA, but in the sense they might be being updated at different times. And the verifiable credential doesn't get updated in itself. It gets updated through another process of revocation and so on. That was a long answer, sorry. Manuel, yes, go ahead.
Just very briefly, just for clarification, it gets trickier because even within the same jurisdiction, when it comes to the LEI, you have several local operating units competing. You may have within the same jurisdiction private local operating units, which are companies, such as Bloomberg, for instance, and you may have public institutions such as the business registers, which in many cases in Europe, there are also local operating units. So in the case of the business registers, it is possible to link almost in real time, if not in actual real time, the contents of the business register with the reference date of the LEI, which is that holds a lot of value. In my opinion, is a differentiated value proposition in comparison with the private local operating units, which focus more on price and convenience for the users and whatnot. But the point here is that when there are changes in the legal status of the registered companies, In the case of business registers operating as local operating units, this is instantly discoverable and published. But in the case of private LOUs, you have to rely on the legal entity for them to communicate to the local operating unit managing your LEI. These changes will be included and communicated to GLI. So,
yep.
So it's not something that you can expect within a certain jurisdiction. It depends on who's actually managing the LEI for that particular legal entity. So I think there are a lot of disclaimers and a lot of explaining to do to set the expectations right, because otherwise people may have expectations which are not realistic and may lead to some misunderstandings. I think that disclaimers are very, very important, and that there shouldn't be a well, I'm complicating myself. What I'm trying to do is that it's very important to make very clear for the users of the system that the legal effects and the value of the information will rely exclusively on the legal framework and the liability regime of the business register backing that information.
Yes.
Because if you create expectations on for a certain jurisdiction, there may be very important differences which may be problematic. That was my point.
Absolutely right. You've done a very eloquent explanation of it's both complicated and we need to be careful. And I absolutely agree with all what you said, Manuel. So I think that was where in this document where Alina started was like kind of what does it mean to have a digital identity anchor? What is the authoritative registrar asserting? And you're absolutely right. Whatever it asserts, whatever its legal infrastructure and jurisdictional framework asserts, it means. And all we can do with this project is hopefully help people understand for each jurisdiction what that actually does mean. Over time, maybe there's a kind of raising up to the ceiling, kind of raise the floor, kind of things get better as people realize that there are some jurisdictions that are doing things a little faster and better. Joe, how are you doing?
Just very quickly, in that case, what we're doing as part of this GTR initiative is actually just to provide metadata that allows digital identity anchors to be actually accessed and understood. Is that what we're doing?
That's a good way of describing it. Yes, there's a yes, absolutely right. That's exactly what we're doing. And to the extent that it becomes possible, you obviously want to make it machine readable, automatable, etc. Right? But there's a strong pragmatic streak in me that recognizes that's probably not going to be possible to the fullest extent. Certainly not the beginning. So just a direction of what exists.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So rather than trying to take all the UNTP information and try and include it in here, we're not trying to do that. We're trying to create the metadata that allows UNTP to actually operate in that way.
That's a good way. That's the unique value that we're adding. That's the new value we're adding. I think what's happening if you look at this document and what the work that Alina's done is that I'd say there may be, I think there is value in this work that might be well fed back into the UNTP spec.
Yes.
In other words, we might change the way the digital identity anchor spec in UNTP is expressed, because we found some things that are really important for them to include or exclude or to explain or whatever. So we'll modify that that sort of part of the document for UNTP. So the document goes on. There's a sort of chunk of what Lena's called clauses, because she writes like a lawyer in a nice way. And then there's a bunch of stuff to do with sort of more non-normative, as we might call it, if we're talking about engineering stuff around explanatory text that follows. So I gave the link in the chat. The link will be in the minutes of the meeting as well, and you're very welcome to have a look at it. We're at time, but I will quickly talk about the work that Marcus did, and that I'm digesting right now. Marcus basically took the current kind of markdown text and went through that markdown text and sort of made some suggestions about how it might be improved based on his considerable experience in the same sort of supply chain registrar sort of space, but for South America. And those suggestions are sort of ones that we can consider as we kind of work out how to propose updates. One of the things that sort of for me is clear is that he's gone into the 8 requirements that existed in the UNTP spec, and I now need to work out how to take the, I don't know what the number was, 40 or so clauses that Alina came up with, and reconcile these with the 8. Which gets me to the last sort of bit, which I wanted to get to a little earlier, because I know it's the time I promised to finish. What I'm trying to work out is how to take this work and kind of get back to one place again. I've got sort of threads of development that are happening now. I've got the ideas that Lena's doing on sort of legal constructs for digital identity anchors. I've got the work that Marcus has been doing on the sort of existing markdown spec description of a digital identity anchor. What I'm considering is how I resolve this. Do I allow the discussions to continue in these separate documents and then try and combine the results of these separate discussions, or do I pull them into one document now without the resolution of the comments to allow those comments to be resolved? Sankashan, save me.
I think you would run a risk of never-ending conversations if you allow the forks to continue.
Yep.
You might want to bring them into a main branch or a single document, keep the comments, and then also allow the context to be available so that you are now having one single document on which you can finalize and refine and do whatever you want to do.
2 thumbs up. That's what I was hoping. I didn't Dorothy Dix this. I didn't plan that.
And if you want help in doing that, I'll volunteer time on this.
I knew I liked Sankashan. That's perfect, Sankashan. That's exactly what I want to do. So I obviously I need to do tomorrow's meeting as well, which is the sort of friendly for the Pacific Standard Time Zone, and go through it there. But that's kind of where I'm heading on the thinking, is let's combine them to get back into a sort of single space. We can each then look at technical requirements as well as legal requirements and make sure that we're not duplicating or leaving gaps. That was it for today, everybody. Is there any other questions that people or comments people want to make before we call it a wrap?
Good, John. Well done for dealing with that, Alina. I'm hoping that she's
Yeah, me too.
supportive of where we were talking about.
I'm sure I didn't do justice to her work, but I hope I did.
Not really fair. It's a very good piece of work.
Yeah. So, thank you all, everybody. The minutes and the recording will be publicly available. And if you're on the groups.io list, you'll get a sort of an email about that. You'll also see it on the other channels. We've got a Slack channel, groups.io, and I typically post something on LinkedIn if we're doing something as well. Okay. Thank you all. Have a great day, evening, morning, wherever in the world. See you next time.
Have a good one. Bye.
Take care.